dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Tim Donner. Now, Tim, I think the natural endpoint for our show here is to discuss what's really on everybody's mind, and that is, what will it take to make New York City great again? Now, it's certainly a great city as far as I'm concerned. Is it as great as it once was, though? Now, you're a New Yorker by geography and presumably by soul, Tim, although you are once removed now, I guess. So is New York as great as it used to be? And what are some of the problems that perhaps make it not quite the shining city on the hill that many thought it was?
Well, I think that the thing that New York has lacked for the longest time, with a few exceptions, such as Rudy Giuliani and Michael Bloomberg, has been subpar leadership, going all the way back to John Lindsay in 1969 and forward. The city
conservative liberal.
yes, liberal Republican. I mean, he defined the Rockefeller Republican moniker from back in those days. Those kind don't even exist anymore. But the lack of leadership from the bulk of the mayors over the last 50 years has been the biggest problem in terms of an ongoing problem.
Yeah.
But the biggest problem now that has to be reversed is New York's status as a sanctuary city. Now, for a long time, there wasn't a great cost to that. It was just virtue signaling. Oh, yes, we're compassionate here and we welcome all comers, whether they're legal or illegal immigrants. But they had to pay the piper for this. Once Governor Greg Abbott of Texas and Ron DeSantis of Florida said, okay, the Biden administration is letting in untold millions of illegal immigrants. We're not going to pay the price for this alone. We're going to send these illegal immigrants up north to these self-declared sanctuary cities. And it basically said, you want to call yourself a sanctuary city? Well, here you go. Deal with these millions of illegal immigrants who were allowed to come into the country. There's no question that Eric Adams, the current mayor for a few more weeks, New York had all these immigrants dumped on them, dumped on him and the city. And it's taken a tremendous toll in terms of crime, in terms of having to divert precious resources to keeping these people alive and fed. And yet, so many of them have gone out and committed crimes. They've overcrowded the city. I think if you reverse the sanctuary city status, that would go a long way towards allowing the city to correct its problems. Of course, there's not a chance in the world that Zoran Mamdani will renounce the sanctuary city status, but it also means he doesn't have to take it quite so literally. He's not going to have the problem that Eric Adams had, which is an overwhelming influx of tens or hundreds of thousands of new residents that have to be taken care of because none of them had jobs and they still had to eat and live and exist. And hopefully in a way that wasn't going to cause them to go out and commit crime because of the fact that they were impoverished, hungry, or whatever. So I think the sanctuary city thing is really the biggest single method. Reversing that would be the biggest single method of sort of flipping the switch in New York. But on a smaller scale, this is something that Andrew Cuomo and Curtis Lewa, the competitors of Mamdani during the mayoral election, they both wanted more cops, 5,000 more cops in the case of Andrew Cuomo. Now, Mamdani has not renounced it or said he will refuse to. He says he's happy with the 35,000 cops that they have now. But there's no question in a city riven by crime where people are afraid to ride the subway or go out at night. To have that extra police presence would make an enormous difference to make New York safe again.
There's he's put up this proposal to have a literal army of social workers to go and deal with what's a mental health crisis call rather than a criminal call. I've spent actually some considerable time trying to think that through. We talk about a lot of things. Sometimes we don't think about the things too in depth, but I've really spent considerable time trying to play this out for different angles to see how this would work. And the idea that you can send a social worker to something that a dispatcher would have to determine, is this somebody having a mental health crisis, and is it likely to turn violent? A dispatcher, somebody who sits there and just fields the calls out. They'll have to choose, does it go this way, does it go that way? They'll be determining what kind of response ends up. And I would imagine that a significant proportion of the violent crimes that take place in New York City are mental health driven anyway. But that doesn't mean that they don't require an actual police response. I mean, sure, how are you going to convince the guy who's trying to set fire to somebody on the subway? Hey, you know what? Maybe we sit down, we have a coffee, we talk about it. While he's lighting somebody on fire. I mean,
look, I think that the theory behind Mamdani's plan makes sense in theory, which is if we can send social workers in to handle disputes that don't really threaten to turn violent, it will free up the cops to engage with serious crime. Sure. But the problem is that domestic violence, I've talked to a couple of cops about this, and what they say is that domestic violence, domestic disputes are the hardest to negotiate because tensions are so high. If a husband's beating his wife or vice versa, a social worker isn't going to be able to go in and convince the husband to suddenly turn his life around and stop beating his wife. I mean, you go and you say, when did you stop beating your wife? Okay, so the theory is not a bad one, which is that if you can channel real law enforcement to a crime that's considered serious, then you can use social workers for those crimes which aren't, or those disputes which aren't. But you put your finger on it. It's almost impossible to know simply from a 911 call whether a dispute is something that can be handled by a social worker or a cop. And in most cases, I'm assured, a social worker is not equipped to handle any kind of domestic dispute because they don't want reason. They don't want rationality. They're hot under the collar and they need active intervention by a trained policeman.
Yeah, I think the outcome of this will be hurt social workers, or even worse. Which brings us to one other policy that I've given quite some thought to, and that's Zoran Mamdani's plan for the bus services in New York City to be free. Now, you can see why that would be a good thing for many low-income people who are trying to either trying to go to work and back home or looking for work where they got to crisscross the city. It's saving them, and it might not be much, but it adds up day after day, especially for low-income Americans. So you can kind of say, well, that would actually be a good helping hand. But the reality of the situation, I mean, who has to deal with the drug addicts who think, well, here's a nice, safe place for me to get high and sleep and perhaps even live. I can live on the bus for most of the day and even the night bus services and things, because they don't have to pay for a ticket. Now, is it bus drivers who are going to have to clear them out? And under what right will they clear them out when the city pays for bus travel? They're traveling by the virtue of being on there.
I think you're going to inevitably see the same thing happen to buses as it's already happening on the subways, which are not free. But if they're free, that says anybody can get on at any time and at least theoretically can stay on for as long as they want.
Sure.
Because it becomes a public right. And when you turn it from a commodity into a right, it's going to be a very slippery slope to try and deny people the length of time they want to stay on a bus. It's going to make them more unsafe because you're going to get people who are mentally ill and or homeless, and the crossover there is very high, who are, basically inhabiting buses, and that's going to drive people away from that kind of public transit and therefore make the whole free bus service counterproductive.
Yeah.
It will actually drive people away from buses rather than towards them because they won't be safe.
Yeah, that's pretty much the end result that I can't seem to escape. That no matter which way I try and think around the issue, is you end up with people who would rather be either on the street doing their drugs and sleeping and just enjoying whatever life they have there, or would they like to be, especially in winters, would they like to be in a nice warm bus moving from place to place with nobody there to usher them along, no major street violence taking place just aimed at them, because they are the homeless people and the drug addicts, that they are victims of a lot of street violence. I mean, they're also the perpetrators of a lot of street violence, but they're also the victims of it. And if they can just hang out on a bus, well, great for them, not so great for everybody else, right?
Well, you just ask yourself a question. Suppose you were addicted to drugs and homeless, and it's winter.
Yeah.
Where would you want to be? On the street?
Sign me up, Zoran Mandani.
I mean, I think anybody would make that choice. And that's the problem with the motivation behind these free buses, is that they may be well-intended, but, unintended consequences of policies like that could be disastrous for New York and make it even more unsafe than it is now.
It's a fine line, and it's a tough one to walk for making New York City great again. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for being with us on the show today.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guest today, Mr. Tim Donner, longtime host of this here radio show. And, of course, you, the listeners, who take the time each week to tune in and hear what we have to say and join the discussion. You are appreciated. Please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.